Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another fireside chat here as part of our 2024 FreightWaves Net Zero Carbon Summit. I'm Kaylee Nix, and we are super excited to be here with another really insightful chat for you on this Wednesday. Joining me is Andrew Wishnia, who is a partner over at EpicWorks Advisors. Andrew, you're calling to us from DC, if that gives us any indication about what we're going to talk about, all things policy. Thank you for being here.
It's a real honor. Thanks for having me.
So you've actually been part of our conversation around climate policy, climate change, and transportation before in previous years, but it's been quite a while, and you are now part of EpicWorks Advisors. Go ahead and give us a little bit of background on what you guys do and where you sit in kind of the policy development space and all things legislation.
Great. Thanks so much. Kaylee, thanks so much for having me, and it's great to be with your listeners once again. The bipartisan infrastructure law and the provisions within are not self-executing, and neither are many in the Inflation Reduction Act or other federal resources. And so as a result, we wanted to provide as much capacity building as possible on the outside. So my colleagues and I established a firm, EpicWorks Advisors, to do just that, to provide capacity building and matchmaking between the public and private sectors to leverage the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and other federal resources to their highest and best use. It turns out that these laws on their own can significantly reduce emissions, improve resilience outcomes, make permitting more efficient and more effective without undermining environmental protections. But we can get even greater efficiencies, even greater emission reductions if we work together. And I think that's going to be part of our decarbonization story going forward. And that's certainly part of the story that animates these laws, which is how do we work together to establish P3s where they're needed, not to supplant private investment, but to supplement it and to look for opportunities to nudge policy forward in ways that make business sense for companies and that make practical sense for communities. So that's part of our story insofar as how we are thinking about how to contribute to sort of the convergence of transportation, energy, and industry going forward. And that's one of the added values that we provide.
I think that that's a sentiment that we can see across every conversation that we have about climate policy and the intersection with transportation, not just in context of like a summit like this one, but also I think just in larger conversation is that a lot of the work being done is dependent on teamwork. And what we don't talk enough about is that fact that we're not trying to supplant the private investment, like you said, or supplant the public-private partnership. We're trying to supplement it by doing these types of things. And in your previous role, you actually were directly involved with the Department of Transportation. Can you explain a little bit about that and how it led you to the transition now of establishing this outside firm that is kind of that support system to getting some of this legislation passed?
Yeah, the bipartisan infrastructure law has a long history that includes hundreds of thousands of stakeholders from across the country who supported provisions within it before the name attached to it. So many years previously, both myself and my colleagues were in the Senate, where we worked on the legislation that led up to the bipartisan infrastructure law. And these kinds of transformational infrastructure laws don't happen overnight. They're certainly supported to an enormous extent by an administration that's willing and capable and that prioritizes infrastructure investments. So part of the story of the bipartisan infrastructure law is how much determination, perseverance, and stick-to-itiveness it took from so many folks from inside the administration and outside the administration to make these laws, ultimately happen and be successful. One specific example is we took $1 billion program for EV charging infrastructure that was passed out of the Environment and Public Works Committee in 2017 and turned that into a $7.5 billion program to transform the nation's electric vehicle charging infrastructure network. But for the administration's support, that wouldn't have been realized. But it was also a product of many members of Congress and their staff and stakeholders who were determined for many months and years to see that particular initiative come to fruition. And the Bipartisan Infrastructure Fund and Inflation Reduction Act are littered with stories of that sort.
I love that you bring that up, because I think that's a very common misconception that a lot of folks who aren't privy to the governmental process think, right? They think, okay, well, the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law were passed during Biden's presidency, which is essentially going to be the hallmark of his presidency as far as legislation goes, with both the size and the impact of both of those bills. But the groundwork that was laid happened in administration 2, maybe even 3, before actually seeing that come to fruition. And I love that you bring that up, because it helps clarify a ton of points. And I think maybe help folks understand that these decisions don't get made in a vacuum, and they're not necessarily made based on who's holding highest in the United States, right? Because that can be, I guess, kind of a little disheartening when we look at the way that climate policy has historically been treated on a partisan level. And that leads me into the question of, obviously, we're in an election year, and things are very contentious with this election. And a lot of folks are concerned that some of the progress that has been made during a Democratic administration would potentially be reversed during a Republican administration if we were to see the presidential office flip. When it comes to climate policy, specifically the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill, is there anything that folks need to be worried about when we're talking about going into a contentious election year? Or has that groundwork been laid, the law's been passed, and the money already started flowing enough where the projects are fairly safe and insulated?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Kaylee. And we get that question probably more often than any other question, particularly in the height of an election season. So it's a really great opportunity to sort of clarify and crystallize one point, which is when we're talking about the resources and the bipartisan infrastructure law, by and large, many of those investments will not get touched as a result of a presidential election, no matter who wins and no matter what scenario there is. All of these have caveats, and we can get to that. But I just want to state upfront that if you were, fundraising for a particular company or looking for investments to decarbonize your transportation system, your infrastructure system, your energy systems, many of these investments will continue irrespective of who's in office and what outcome that is. A lot of that has to do with the budgetary mechanisms and a very esoteric conversation about both parliamentary procedure and the way that Congress appropriates dollars to different departments. And just one example of that is the money that's appropriated to highway programs is contract authority. It's not appropriated budget authority, which means the dollars have already been appropriated through an authorization by both the authorizing and appropriating committees. So that money is effectively lockboxed. And that is important because the Federal Highway Administration controls the vast majority of the funds under the purview of the U.S. Department of Transportation. That includes all of the charging infrastructure money, but also resilience dollars, carbon reduction dollars, CMAQ dollars, and so forth. It is true that there could be circumstances, and there will, of course, be conversations on the edges related to the Inflation Reduction Act. But I think those conversations are going to be few and far between, because at the end of the day, these investments touch not just blue states, but red states. Whether you're in Kentucky or Georgia or Tennessee or Alabama, you have major manufacturing facilities that are benefiting from these investments. And the same can be said across the country as well. Kaylee, I just want to clarify one other point, because I think nuance is critical in these kinds of conversations. But for the president, there is no question that the bipartisan infrastructure law wouldn't have come about. But two things can be true. What can also be true is that the run-up, to your point, of these types of transformational pieces of legislation have a lot of thought leaders, and that thought leadership, existed many years prior. It doesn't mean that we have a perfect system going forward. We have a lot of work to do, but we have started to turn the tide. We have the first climate title in an infrastructure bill. And the notion of decarbonizing our transportation system is now inculcated into, the U.S. Department of Transportation and the, transportation regime as part of the interagency efforts to decrease emissions as a whole.
As we like to say, teamwork does indeed make the dream work, especially when it comes to getting things accomplished in Washington. I want to bring this back to the actual transportation space a little bit to kind of round out the last 5 minutes or so of our discussion today and talk a little bit about what this means for folks who are actual stakeholders and players in the transportation space. Obviously, we know both of these bills appropriate a decent amount of federal funding that can go to carriers or independent owner operators, folks who are looking to expand alternative fuel programs, invest in EVs, get into EV charging. But what other opportunities exist that directly benefit and impact specifically the truck transportation space or our broader network of logistics and good movements across America?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we're focused on at EpicWorks Advisors, is providing sort of a landscape analysis of how to decarbonize those wedges of the transportation pie that contribute to the most amount of emissions, and do so in a way that achieves the company's triple bottom line, including, of course, making money. I think we can think about freight sort of in the traditional way, and decarbonizing freight in the traditional way, insofar as converting to clean options and more efficient vehicles. And there are certainly many, many programs from which to do so. We were talking about electrification a little earlier, and the Federal Highway Administration just released some of their charging and fueling infrastructure discretionary grant dollars, some of which went to medium and heavy duty applications. One example of that is the I-5 corridor in the Pacific Northwest, where that is going to be electrified for medium and heavy duty applications. The Department of Energy last year also released some money for hydrogen hubs, also which serve medium and freight, medium and heavy duty freight applications as well. So I would put that in one bucket. And then there's another bucket which folks may think of a little less freight dependent, but certainly have a ton of emissions implications, which is from an active transportation standpoint. If you're supporting bike networks and pedestrian networks, then you're also supporting first mile and last mile users. And you're able to come up with different applications to reduce emissions where you may not need to deadhead medium and heavy duty trucks into a city, but you may be able to downsize your fleet and thereby create efficiencies for your business and reduce pollution in your community. So I think when you look at the landscape of programs, you can really attack both formula and grant opportunities and stack opportunities on top of each other to take advantage of so many different pots of money, which serve different applications, but make for a comprehensive picture within your business, within your company, within your community. And that augurs to the benefit, obviously, of what it is that you're trying to solve for. But it also is what the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act are intended toward as well.
Last question before we let you go, Andrew. Is there any particular subset of these initiatives, any funding buckets or projects that you personally are super excited to see continue to develop and come to fruition?
Yeah, so as part of our work at the U.S. Department of Transportation and as part of our interagency efforts with so many brilliant colleagues and teams from across the interagency, one of the things that we produced was a U.S. transportation decarbonization blueprint. So for the first time ever, that was a thesis from the federal government between the U.S. Department of Energy, Housing and Urban Development, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. Department of Transportation as to how to create a comprehensive picture from which to decarbonize transportation. It turns out that at least 15% of emissions in our transportation sector are from inefficient design and operational efficiency, much of which can be rectified from the freight sector. So as we were talking about from a first mile, last mile perspective, I think it's incredibly exciting to look at the micromobility landscape and to look at active transportation opportunities. Sometimes we gloss over active transportation because it's potentially a little less sexy than newer technologies, but it is critically important and vitally effective to decarbonize our transportation sector. And the good news is, even from a freight standpoint, there are so many opportunities to look to take advantage of active transportation networks as a way of getting into and out of cities and communities without necessarily needing always to use medium and heavy duty applications. That doesn't mean that those applications won't exist here and going forward. They absolutely will. But any opportunity there is to diversify or create additional options is going to improve the effectiveness of our transportation system for everyone. And these aren't nice to have options. They're absolutely necessary from a pollution standpoint, from a climate change standpoint, and from a fiscal imperative standpoint as well.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us as part of our Net Zero Carbon Summit. I think that this really adds some clarity and some wisdom to some of the things that go on that are maybe a little bit murky for folks in this space. If people want to reach out to you guys at EpicWorks Advisors, where can they go to do that?
You can go to www.epicworksadvisors.com. We have a website with contact information. You can also reach me personally at aw@epicworksadvisors.com too.
Great. Thank you so much again for joining us. We appreciate it so much. And thank you all for staying tuned with us through the entirety of our Net Zero Carbon Summit here today. If you missed any of our segments, make sure that you find them on demand on our YouTube channel as well as on FreightWaves.com. We'll be back with more right after this.